Thank you very much indeed for the time, for the generosity, and this beautiful book that enlightened a lot of issues about cynicism. If you don't mind, I start with a very brief introductory note about you and then with the questions. So David Mazella is professor in the English department at University of Houston. He specializes in 18th century British literature. His first book, A Cultural and Conceptual History of the Cynic and Cynicism in Great Britain, is entitled The Making of Modern Cynicism, University of Virginia Press, 2007. He has also published articles on Lawrence Stern, Thomas Hobbes, and George Lillo. So David, my first question, what was the reason for you to write such an elaborate, intricate, and even amusing book on a topic which is usually regarded as dry and even wearisome?
Well, that's a cynical description of scholarship. Okay, so there's a self-reflexivity about this, right? And I have to say that there's a kind of thread in this book about trying to do scholarly work in conditions that, as far as I could tell, have only grown more chaotic every year that I do scholarly work. And the thing that I became aware of as I was moving through graduate school and then the job market and then getting a job and then being in a university that didn't quite know how to be a university and then getting tenure. I mean, I went through every stage of this saying to myself, well, these institutions really have interesting ideals, but the practices are quite distant from whatever the ideals are. And this was generally treated like sort of a, just a routine thing that nobody really wanted to comment about. They really didn't want to analyze particularly. It was just something that was taken for granted. And I thought, well, okay, now that's interesting, that this thing that everybody feels, this dissonance, is not really discussed. And I think it has to do with this kind of indirection that you just mentioned. I think that there's a sense of belonging or not belonging to institutions, and acknowledging those feelings is really, it's difficult, because I think that we have these institutions for reasons. I mean, there's a reason why the university exists, like it or not. And they may not do what they're supposed to do. They may not act the way they're supposed to, but there are reasons for them. And so people feel that dissonance. And I was feeling that dissonance, and I also felt that it was important to bring that out because, as I said, it felt to me as if that dissonance just increased day after day. And of course, I was doing this, during the first Iraq War, the second Iraq War. A lot of stuff was going on. Trump later on. I mean, so to a certain extent, it was my attempt to kind of incorporate that sense of dissonance into my scholarship in a way that I felt would be valuable to other people. And, I've always had an interest in humor. I mean, you don't specialize, you don't write a dissertation in 18th century literature if you don't have a particular love of satire, I don't think. So Swift was hugely important for me. The sort of established satirists of the 18th century and the 17th century were important to me. But then I realized that there's a kind of dynamic between, the period's kind of interest in sentimentalism and its interests in satire. And this was no great discovery. But what I discovered as I pursued it was that the writers were very aware of it, the audiences and reviewers were very aware of it, and the kind of dialectic or interchange between those perspectives was really important. And it's also something that changed, because at a certain point, the satire kind of fell away in many ways, and a different kind of model of writing sort of emerged. So as I was thinking about all of these issues, I was really struck by how much these feelings of dissonance really mattered to me as a scholar and as a reader, but also to the readers at this particular moment in time. And I wrote a dissertation about sentimentality and anti-sentiment. And so it was really focused very traditionally on sort of opposing views of 18th century novels and things like that. And I wrote that dissertation, and it was totally unmanageable. And when I got a job, my first priority was to revise that into a book, and then I discovered that was impossible because there were really 5 or 6 different books kind of squashed together under the pressure of writing a dissertation. And as I revised that book, I kind of revised the old book out of existence. And what I discovered was that I was very interested in the presentist kinds of issues of cynicism. And when I began to use that term, it's like, oh, well, how does this fit in? And it was not a term that was particularly important, as a kind of hegemonic term, as a kind of, keyword in 18th century writing, although it does recur. So initially I dismissed it, and then I thought, well, that's not really legit. And then I began to incorporate it, and that's when I thought, well, this is genealogy. This is the attempt to find a kind of alternative history that really is not like the other components of established philosophical history. And Sloterdijk helped lead me there. Other kinds of scholars helped lead me to kind of begin to see this. And then as I thought about it, I began to be able to talk about it in a more concerted way. And as I did that, I really began to feel confident that I had a narrative, but it took a very long time to arrive at that narrative. And the book was always too long and too complicated. And I had some very, very fine editors and readers who helped me along, Adam Patke, Kathy Brettschneider at the time at UVA. And essentially, the manuscript was completely bonkers. And so it had to get sort of edited into a kind of thesis-driven argument. And that's how I sort of arrived at this book. I'm actually struck by the fact that you called it, simple, because it was not simple to write.
Right. I mean, the prose was.
Well, I try, and but
Yeah.
what I can tell you is that Foucault's model of scholarship, to me, was really the guiding principle in terms of writing stuff that sort of addresses the complexity, but does not try to waffle around too much in its engagement with the issues. And I thought that cynicism is the kind of topic that doesn't really benefit from certain kinds of meditative or intellectual kinds of approaches. And that's where I began to get hints from the ancient trajectory, which is really about kind of an anti-theoretical theory. It's got a paradoxical edge to it that is very, very useful. And I think it's one of the chief reasons why it survived through all the transformations that I tried to track, that there's a kind of awareness of the useless, the total uselessness of certain kinds of intellectual discourse, because it's a kind of distraction. A deflection.
Sorry to interrupt you, David. Do you really mean that? I mean, can we claim, that there is a kind of cynic style of writing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it can only be conveyed in writing, in speech, but also in gesture.
Also
right?
in gesture, right?
And so, I mean, it's one of the reasons why the dandy kind of plops in at a certain point, because I mean, Foucault's sense that there's a sort of performance of self fits in very nicely with this idea that, the dandy sort of announces himself. I guess there are possibilities for female dandies. I guess
Right.
there's that too. But there's sort of performative possibilities there that allow people to sort of announce a certain kind of irony, a certain kind of distance, a certain kind of questioning of conventional values. And the more economical, the more pointed that is, the more effective it will be.
Right.
So I mean, that kind of that thread is really important to it because there is a Cynic style, but of course it can't be prescribed, and it just has to be enacted
and
and
practiced, right?
and and so I mean, in the same way, there's nothing more painful than somebody who cannot tell a joke, repeating somebody else's joke. It has to be told with sufficient verve and economy that somebody can get it, and that's a very high bar. I mean, I mean, there's a reason why stand-up comedians are psychotic. I mean, they the strain of trying to produce laughs from people is extraordinary. I mean, it's a psychic strain, and what happens, I think, is that people get sort of reduced to joke machines,
Right.
and there's a kind of automatism to it, and so it takes an enormous kind of reservoir of ideas and thoughts to be like a Lichtenberg, right? To have just, basically to, literally just write aphorisms and for other people to revisit them and say, holy shit, this is the most surprising thing I read today.
Right.
That wit is really, really important. And I mean, it's a high bar.
Right.
I mean, there aren't that many people who are intelligent enough, witty enough, expressive enough to kind of perform that. And then also to have the kind of stance of, a certain kind of self-confidence in their assertion.
Right. David, right in the beginning of the book, you make it clear that cynicism in its modern usage provokes suspicion, anger, disillusion, and distrust among those who care about politics. Why is it so? Yet, as you also point to it in parts of the book, you would not have written a book on cynicism if you believed that change is impossible or political discussion was a futile undertaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is kind of what I tried to nail down, the idea of a cynical situation where the actual speech that people contribute is not as important as the situation that kind of produces that speech. And there's probably a kind of anthropological theory that I could draw upon, but I didn't know what it was then, and I probably still don't know now. But I think that when you talk about the suspicion, the idea is that if you care about politics, you want political discussion to make a difference, to matter. And yet, I think everybody's everyday experience of politics is that their own views are absolutely irrelevant to other people, to institutions, to the people who have the power, and it takes all of your effort to get anything registered. In a local election, your judge, your local prosecutor or judge, and so it takes a lot of energy expended to make that kind of difference. And even then, it's only going to be directed in one thing as opposed to all the other stuff that you can do. So the idea that the whole enterprise could collapse is kind of the pessimism that political discussion creates, because it's, I think, in a lot of ways, inherently demoralizing. It is disillusioning to deal with other people. And so you have to have some kind of confidence. I won't say faith, because I hate installing religious language into political discussion, as you may have noticed. And so if you're using this kind of faith, this kind of language to talk about what gets you through the process, I think that there's a kind of pragmatism to it. Like, maybe this time it will work. And that's the only kind of hope that I kind of hold out. Maybe this time it will work. Because if you believe that it won't ever work, then again, you just crawl up and die. There's no, I mean, there's no way to think about politics except as a kind of undertaking that one goes into because of the stakes, but without any kind of ready expectation that you're going to hit some kind of jackpot and everything will be okay, because unfortunately there are all these other people with views that don't coincide with yours. So, I mean, a lot of this is really about the way that conflict and disagreement get processed. And there is clearly, good conflict and good disagreement, but unfortunately there's a lot of conflict and disagreement about which conflicts and disagreements are productive and useful, and so that's your problem all over again. So I think that the cynic feels like somebody who's kind of freeloading, somebody who just kind of opts out of the thing that everybody else is trying to do. And I think that in some cases that's a fair description. It's just that there are a lot of things that aren't so well thought through or aren't so well done. And if you try to bring attention to those things, you can be accused of sabotaging something ultimately that could be positive. And I don't know any prescriptive way to kind of figure out how that's going to work. So I mean, I think that my stance is basically sort of pragmatist, in kind of the vulgar sense, because it really just is about trying to sort of live this as an everyday thing, and not trying to burden yourself too much.
Right, but at the same time, but David, you also mentioned, I'm quoting you, that cynics are feared because they threaten the public with a genuinely worrying prospect, a future without hope of meaningful change. At the very least, cynics foresee a future in which individuals have little chance of fixing their problems or improving their conditions in life or at work. Is it true? Like, they are feared for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no better way to direct all sorts of negative attention to yourself by speaking up at an inopportune moment and saying, well, wait a second, what's going on here? And the fear part, I think, really is about the way that groups of people sort of defend decisions, the way they defend certain kinds of identities and certain kinds of actions. And the fear is about, if we grant this criticism, then somehow or other will explode. And there is a kind of fear of disagreement because people assume, and I think rightly, that it is only in the unity of a particular group that you can sort of fend off a lot of those kinds of criticisms and a lot of the different kinds of the kinds of friction that occur. But there's also kind of there's a potential for learning there, and if the the group, whatever kind of social intelligence you're talking about, doesn't do something about it, then they just continue to fail or muddle through. So the fear is really about the future and the prospects for the future, and the problem is really that one future is, in some sense, the pessimistic view of it is that nothing is going to change and we don't need to do anything at all. We'll just sit here and suffer. And then there's the risk that you undertake by trying to move in a particular way, take a particular kind of risk, change what you're doing, learn from what's going on, all those kinds of options. And that kind of status quo inertia is really, really much greater in everyday life than most political theorists like to think about.
Right.
And so, I mean, the de Certeau, the whole perspective of de Certeau for me was really, really key because, the idea of an everyday life and those politics are often really just about accommodation. And that accommodation, though, can't really be mistaken for acquiescence. So there's an old English proverb: no matter how hard you try, you can't polish a turd. And you know what it is, and you're not really making a mistake here, but also you're not going to try to stop.
Right.
So all of these things are about the fear that disagreement or conflict can create, and the degree to which conflict is actually necessary for, a group to kind of sort out what it's going to do, what kind of decisions it's going to make, and so forth.
One of the interesting parts of your genealogical um, uh, analysis of cynicism refers back to the figure of Diogenes. In the afterlife of cynical philosophy, you introduce two modes or versions of Diogenes appeared, the classical and the vernacular. Could you please explain a bit about it? Because I found it really interesting. I want your explanation about it.
Well, so this is all, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Nicholas Probsting? How do you say his name?
Diogenes
Diogenes. So basically, that essay that he did about the sort of afterlife, the legacies of cynicism, talked about Rousseau, for example, as one of the versions of that. But I mean, there are multiple vernacular versions of Diogenes that happen in every major European language, basically because, in my argument, he was really remembered through the rhetorical tradition. And the rhetorical tradition is interesting because it's not necessarily literary. It's more like the declamations that little boys, were sort of beaten into, and in their schools, their little Latin speaking schools. So the rhetorical tradition gave people this sense of a character, and then this character, because he was sort of ubiquitous culturally, was sort of picked up on and then sort of elaborated in a number of different sort of vernacular concepts. So that leaping off of Diogenes from a kind of philosophical tradition, and remember that there is no record of it except what other people say about it. So there is no sort of objective text that you can go back to. It's purely kind of a construction, retrospective construction of who Diogenes was and what he meant. But the movement was big and visible enough to have made a huge impact on the ancient world, and then that was sort of brought into a whole series of successive, sort of cultural contexts and literatures that enabled us to begin to see a polite Diogenes. And that's a kind of paradoxical or absurd notion, but there are sort of, I mean, in the English tradition, there's a kind of wise counselor, Diogenes, that you will pick up in sort of early modern literature. There will be misanthropes and misogynists, and that's another sort of reduction of him into kind of a caricature. And I kind of trace this, this kind of string of vernacular, non-identical. I mean, they don't evolve. They just get sort of thrown off by the cultural moments that they're produced in. And to me, the most important one for my purposes is really what happens with the Enlightenment, and the way that the philosophes get sort of pulled into a kind of Enlightenment, counter-Enlightenment quarrel with Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his enemies, his numerous enemies, sort of during and after his lifetime. And that becomes kind of the moment where cynicism takes a kind of explicitly conservative turn. And it also becomes a moment where what I call the kind of modern cynic really sort of arrives through this kind of version of Hobbes as a cynic. And that's not an identification that would have worked at any previous moment before the early 19th century. Hobbes is problematic, but he has, he has a very distinct kind of philosophy that's very different than the kind of philosophy that's being proposed by the ancient Diogenes. But the vernacular versions have just kind of gone along so far that there's a kind of forgetting of that ancient past. So the vernacularization of this is kind of a sign that the philosophical meanings have been sort of emptied out, and we're dealing now with either a kind of pseudo-philosophical, a kind of false philosophy, but also a kind of, I mean, again, a kind of deflection, a kind of indirection here. Hobbes doesn't really believe the stuff that he's saying. Hobbes is just trying to kind of shore up power. And so he becomes a kind of instrument, a willing instrument of power. And that's where we begin to see the modern cynic get elaborated in all sorts of ways in sort of contemporary political culture.
Right, David, as you demonstrate in the book, I mean, with the growth and the importance of politeness, together with the notion of the superiority of modernity over antiquity, the status of cynical philosopher, uh, the state of cynical philosophy or philosopher descended to the level of burlesque. The cynic becomes a comic type, sneering, jeering, and railing, thoroughly devoid of any moral and social value. To what extent do you attribute that big role to politeness, to the discourse of politeness?
Well, I mean, so Enlightenment philosophy, I mean, obviously, I'm kind of collapsing hundreds of people together to kind of say something like this, but I mean, the kind of discourse of politeness, is sort of grounded in a kind of assumption of ancients and moderns. Not a fully operational sort of historicist background, right? But it's also about trying to get past a certain kind of gross organization of society and trying to allow the presence of women, less hierarchical relations with clergy, fairly elementary changes in our view, but which were very threatening and very scary to at least elites in the 17th and 18th century. And so politeness becomes a way to talk about the reorganization of society along certain kinds of, we'll call it, less hierarchical lines of authority. And so women get admitted into discussion, and priests are not allowed to persecute people for heterodox views. And so the cosmopolitan version of Diogenes is the polite Diogenes, because he's not just insulting people or spitting in people's faces, which is what the ancient philosopher does. I mean, have you ever read Villon's Socrates Out of His Senses? It's kind of a hilarious sort of 18th century sort of reimagining of Diogenes as a kind of free spirit. He kind of goes around and he falls in love with people, and it's a comically 18th century version. It's basically a Sternian rewrite of Diogenes as a kind of sentimentalist. And that reimagining of the cosmopolitan and polite philosopher means that suddenly women are no longer kind of sort of brutally kept under control, and certain kinds of free discourse are possible. Villon's thing has in fact a whole sort of republic of Diogenes that he sort of imagines for that. And so the cosmopolitan version of cynicism is going to be polite because it wants to get past certain aspects of pre-modernity and speak for the future, I guess. I mean, I think, since we've been talking about this, I mean, I think there is a kind of future orientation towards it. And again, that's what makes cosmopolitan views scary, and that's what helps provoke a kind of backlash that you see in the counter-Enlightenment thinkers that kind of really vilify those views. So the polite version of Diogenes is a travesty.
Right.
It's no less a travesty than the burlesque versions, but it's clearly speaking to a certain need or demand for a particular perspective that doesn't quite exist, and that people are trying to sort of articulate so that it can exist. And the problem is that, I mean, if you look at the people who try to inhabit those roles, I mean, you'll get people like William Godwin, who's not satisfactory at all as a Diogenes figure. And so, there is a problem in sort of finding people who can actually inhabit these kinds of roles. The polite, I mean, the polite cynic is a kind of transitional figure, I guess, in the vernacularization as we move towards ultimately that sort of political set. At least that's my view of that.
Yeah. So I go to another question now that he's David, one of the functions of cynicism, or better to say, one of the targets of cynicism is, as you explained already, is this institutionalization, as you explained about, and the beliefs which have shaped them. To what extent is hypocrisy a target of cynicism? I mean, hypocrisy not necessarily in a directly moral sense, but in a political sense, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about a great deal since I wrote this book. And the hypocrisy problem is kind of, I mean, caught up with any kind of pragmatic definition of politics as a kind of negotiation or a kind of transaction. And I didn't make that as clear in the book as I think I could have, but I mean, I'm dealing with such an earlier context, it may not have mattered. But certainly, as we think about contemporary cynicism, the fear that any kind of idealistic language that you could use to describe the institution or its actions is just a kind of transactional kind of payoff at best, or a kind of lip service. We have all sorts of words to talk about gestures that don't have any full commitment behind them. And I mean, those are all, perfectly descriptive ways to talk about political management. But it's also difficult to imagine any democratic politics that doesn't have that degree of hypocrisy institutionalized. I mean, there's a sense in which people come together to to kind of try to negotiate among competing interests. That's not the only way to think about politics, but it's certainly the way that the modern advanced Western European states, that's how they sort of do what they do. And I mean, it gets you into this whole question of whether or not the problem with hypocrisy is not what individuals are doing and thinking and what their motives are, but basically what are the effects of what they're doing. And so hypocrisy, certainly in the way that it's been interpreted in US politics, I can't really speak to any other kind of political culture here now, but in US politics, hypocrisy has been shown to be kind of completely empty, kind of moralistic term that really has no critical purchase on anything that's going on, because it can always get defended as a kind of pragmatism that enables progress or advancement, or things can move, or some kind of action and so forth. And so it feels as if the hypocrisy pragmatism dynamic has completely gone stale. It doesn't really inform anybody of anything, which doesn't mean that it stops. It's just that it becomes another kind of form of savvy that people have to kind of read through. And so I think that I mean, when we talk about deflection, the problem is not the deflection. The problem is what are they trying to distract you from? What are they trying to deflect from? And it's almost always the operations of power that's violent and entrenched. And so that has to be the thing that undergoes the most scrutiny. And it's easier for journalists, for pundits, for commentators to kind of focus on the deflection as a kind of falling away from certain kinds of ideals. But I mean, the only thing that matters, as far as I'm concerned, is what are the operations of power, and how destructive is it? And I mean, as we all know, it can be very, very destructive. It can be very, very damaging. And state power is a very scary thing when it gets directed against certain kinds of populations and people. So, I mean, just my personal example is that here in Texas has always been known as being more American than America, and therefore more bigoted and racist and everything else than what you could imagine. And what I've discovered here in Houston is that this is a very urban place that has a kind of concentration of people that somehow or another not really acknowledged by the rest of Texas. But we've seen a huge amount of anti-trans initiatives. There were bathroom bills, and there are, and now we have these things about student athletes. And I mean, the kind of attitude that I finally taken up towards all these things is that they're deflections. That ultimately this is about state power wanting to kind of move into people's homes, move into people's bodies, and police people, and incarcerate people, and that's what you're dealing with. To debate people on the terms of, well, it's okay for trans kids to be on a football team, is not really getting at what that debate is about. And the U.S. has been sort of totally overtaken by these kinds of charges and this kind of backlash. And I think that focusing too much on the deflection means that you don't really sort of see just how concerted this effort is. And again, that's something that I would rather pay attention to, because it's actually happening on an institutional level. The state houses across the US are all sort of moving in this direction, even if the populations are not really supporting it. So the institutions are important, but not as a kind of source of ideals, but just as a kind of rough guide to where masses of people are going and what they're trying to do. I mean, it's how power gets sort of put into effect.
Right.
And so that's where I find institutions most useful.
Interesting. David, I just want to hear this distinction or this differentiation between the role of a cynic in comparison to the role of the ironists. It's the work of the liberal ironists, as Rorty would call it, with these vocabularies. These were the vocabularies with which the metaphysician had tried to give an absolute interpretive closure to the problems of identity and morals. The ironist, according to him, offers a redescription of such claims. Rorty calls it redescription, and I find it interesting that you also mention you begin by defining political cynicism as a drastic redescription of our experience that reverses existing political and moral vocabularies. How and why should we make a difference between irony and cynicism?
Well, the liberal, I mean, you just have to look at Rorty, right? And Rorty's politics. And the liberal ironist is somebody who has a secure job and is doing fine. He's getting 3 squares, he gets 3 hots in a cot, he's all set. And that's one relationship to the conventional. But I mean, you have to be able to also think about action. And to me, the Foucauldian notion of parrhesia is really about taking risks and saying things to people who will be mad about what you said. They're not going to be happy about that. And it also means that you defend, if you have to, other people who are saying things that are making people mad, for irrational reasons. So in my view, I would much rather, have drag queen story hour, at a little public library like we have in Houston. I think maybe they've shut it down. I don't know. But so drag queen, I mean, those are the bravest people I know, because, there are sort of people picketing those public libraries because drag queens are reading stories to little children. And that's an amazingly brave thing to do. And it's courageous. And so you compare that to Rorty penning his little essays and doing his career, and it's like, well, I mean, Rorty had a good career, but the kind of ability to face down crowds, I mean, which is, in my sense, probably the essence of ancient cynicism. You had to confront the crowd, and if people threw things, you tried not to get too injured. But challenging conventional views is not an easy thing to do. There's nothing prescriptive about it, and sometimes it's like one version of Diogenes who dies eating octopus to see if it's consumable. But I mean, conventional views, when they get challenged, cause reactions and sometimes violent reactions, and so in my view, the liberal ironist is not somebody who's committed to any action on behalf of other people. And you could have a certain kind of distance from conventional views, but if you sit in your study, I mean, as I am right now, I guess, if you're not willing to defend others, if you're not willing to say things yourself that could get you into trouble, then it doesn't really go anywhere. So I think there is some value in it, in that it's not nonsense, but it's not fascist gibble gabble. So 2 thumbs up for Rorty. But I also think that you have, if you're taking this kind of stance as an ironist, you also have to be able to show the emptiness of the views, and confront that in a more active way.
Interestingly, I mean, as you mentioned in the beginning, your inspiration. I mean, you had Sloterdijk in the beginning, and he also interestingly talks about his cheekiness and this courage, probably, as you talk about, like in the figure of cynic. And now it is my question, in a way, that according to him, according to Sloterdijk, cynicism is prevalent in contemporary society, which obstructs political action and negates the empowering potential of knowledge. What is interesting for me is that Sloterdijk seems to move beyond, or even put aside, the everyday notion of cynicism as distrust, and emphasizes its more radical and potent ideological function as enlightened false consciousness. Again, interestingly for me, I mean, talking about this indirectness and directness, I am, like most of the time in Germany, I hear it that, I mean, we are in a direct culture vis-a-vis other cultures, like people are direct, people mean what they really, I mean, do what they really mean. What I think is interesting in Sloterdijk is that he goes beyond this sort of hypocrisy that I could experience in Iran. The hypocrisy in Iran is mostly between private and public. I mean, this indirectness, but the hypocrisy that he is targeting, Sloterdijk is targeting, is another level of hypocrisy. It's like it's even hidden in that kind of directness. It's a kind of passivity. It's a kind of, I don't care.
Yeah, I mean, there are layers to this, right? And I mean, I imagine that in the Iranian situation, the kind of importance of intimacy and privacy for one's own sort of political views is very important. I mean, it's one of the reasons why the early modern situation, might sort of, in some ways be more intelligible than certain kinds of assumptions of a free and open society. Because in the early modern world, if you were unlucky, you could get picked up and get physically brutalized in all sorts of ways. And so we have some of that, but then we also have people who will defend absolute fascist gibble gabble, on the front pages and the op-ed pages. I mean, in all sorts of places. And other people will defend their right, to publish that gibble gabble. So I think that one of the things here is that, I mean, the indirection is part of what enables people to communicate, and it can often be a way that groups can communicate past hostile, people overhearing them, so that they can sort of have a certain kind of solidarity and so forth. And those sort of implicit signs are very, very important. I think that all of the ways that an in-group kind of sort of communicates amongst itself is those things are extraordinarily important. But what obviously the thing that also happens is that people are left out. There's there are going to be people at the top, people at the bottom, and the rest of it. And so it seems like what Sloterdijk is after is a kind of radicalism that, to me, is kind of absolutely devoid of context. It's radicalism, and I mean, that's the aspect of sort of 60s radical culture that I have a lot of trouble understanding, because to me, I mean, I saw a kind of discussion on Twitter where people were just sort of laughing at the Adorno versus the lady's breasts scenario that Sloterdijk uses. Adorno is trying to read, people into order, and then, somebody pulls open her shirt and her bare breasts challenge him. And I was seeing, just this was a Twitter exchange, people just going, LOL, laugh out loud, as if the breasts were any kind of response to Adorno. And it's like, well, it had a certain meaning at that point. It was a gesture that had a certain kind of meaning. Sloterdijk takes that meaning seriously, but it also seems like there's a kind of dated conception of the radical in the idea that you can challenge, any kind of system of power by just taking your clothes off and parading around. And I mean, there is a sense in which I guess you could say the nakedness, even voluntary nakedness, can challenge, conventional views. But I think that if you take that out of the context where, for example, a trans child, can have his genitals inspected by a teacher, that's a different kind of nakedness. And that kid is not getting, that kid is not challenging anybody except to the extent that, that there's a kind of, presumptive biological essentialism that the kid is somehow violating. And so, all the forces of the state are coming down on that kid. So there's I mean, from my perspective, and this is like what 50 years late, the kind of nakedness that Sloterdijk talks about feels very male, very heterosexual, very essentialist, and there might be some value in it. I mean, Adorno needed to have those breasts shown to him just to remind him what breasts were, I guess. But I also think that we're thinking about bodies and nakedness very differently now than people did. The most, the kind of psychoanalytic and Marxist folks in the 60s and 70s were thinking about it because of Foucault and others. I mean, there's a whole line that's gone past that. So I mean, that would be my response. That basically the challenge of Sloterdijk doesn't quite seem as challenging now, given all the other forms of radicalism that are visible now that were not so visible at the time that Adorno and Sloterdijk were writing. I mean, that would be my my offhand comment.
Right. David, I have like two quick questions. Like I'm not going to take here. The question for, I mean, one interesting remark in the book that is that this distinction that you make between strategy and tactic. Right. I mean, in relation to being proper or pop and being appropriate in being a strategic, and then being unexpectedly, let's say, improper, even in terms of being tactical or tactics. Could you please elaborate it? That was very interesting for me and very relevant to the understanding of cynicism, not stoicism.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, so the strategy and tactics thing is something that I learned from de Certeau, and I found it amazingly helpful for beginning to understand
Very much.
the kind of theoretical. I mean, what I think of as the kind of theoretical essence of cynicism, which is that there are strategies that are about a kind of longer term possession of a territory field, and classical rhetoric is very much about a certain kind of order or organization that one sets up, disciplinary thought, institutional thought, all of the ways in which we have turf. Those are important because they needed, the turf needs to be defended. The department has to be defended against the outsiders, all those things. Tactical thinking is about, an insurgency. It's about, what's happening and how do I, invade it? How do I run across it? How do I use that space to my advantage? And that form of thought is often criminalized or kind of, one way or another, it's kind of berated, it's denounced, but it's extraordinarily useful for people who are having power directed at them. And so it's absolutely important that somebody, I mean, if you're a defense lawyer, you have to know, where you can sort of bend the rules, where you can sort of, assert certain kinds of things, what kinds of what kinds of tactics you can use to get at least a momentary advantage from an already rigged game. And so it's about trying in one way or another to at least suspend the advantages that power always has. And that's the kind of temporal orientation too. It's very presentist. But I also think that, I mean, for people who are in a condition of getting certain kinds of power directed at them, even a momentary relief from that is really important. So it's very important to think about it. And philosophically, I think it's relevant that Diogenes is a former slave. I mean, if anything, we don't quite know what the circumstances were. We know that he was owned at one point, like many people in the ancient world, and at another point, he doesn't seem to be owned anymore, but he wanders around. But there's a fugitive aspect to his philosophy that I think sometimes gets missed, and that placelessness is really, really important to understanding what he does and does not defend. He doesn't defend territory, he defends his autonomy. And that is, for him, the crucial question.
It's very interesting for me. Like last 6-7 years, I have been working with refugees in Berlin. I mean, like I'm not doing anything in academia after my PhD. I'm just like doing them. I mean, supporting them linguistically and helping them find some education or job and so on and so forth. But what is really noticeable for me is that because the power is talking to them as you or is directing at them, most of the refugees stick to this tactical or this tactic mechanism, which is most of the time like situational and context bound, and it. I mean, yeah, I think it's inevitable when you are somehow marginalized or you are.
Yeah, and I mean, to a certain extent, it means that you can't get state benefits, right? The state only supports people who are intelligible, under its scrutiny this way. And so if you don't, I mean, in the US, if you don't have a mailing address, you don't have a driver's license, you don't have this or that, you're sort of at the fringes of the economy, you're at the fringes of everything. And so, it's very hard to get access to the state. So, yeah, there are all sorts of ways in which the surveillance state and the surveillance capitalism kind of work together to kind of keep some people in and other people outside. And so the tactical is ultimately a kind of temporal strategy for people to kind of survive day to day. But there's no reason to romanticize it because it's a very hard way to live. Anybody who sort of looks at the things that people have to do to survive. I mean, under these circumstances, if you don't have a bank account, no one can pay you. And nowadays we're going cashless, which makes it even harder because who has a credit card, who's homeless, those kinds of things. So I applaud you for doing the work with refugees, but there's a reason why they exist.
Right.
And the reason why they're treated so badly, and it's partly to to warn the others not to come. And so all of these things are about the way that power tries to set the terms, because that's where their strategy is. And they're trying to set the terms, and then other people have to figure out ways to kind of undo or suspend those rules, for their own survival, basically. Right. They can't thrive if they try to work with those rules without modifying.
And my last question, I promise that's the shortest question possible. What's the role of humor in regard to cynicism?
Well, I'm going to give you a very unfunny response. The role of humor is somehow or other to talk about these things without falling into despair. I think that despair is always a very live option if we're talking about politics and the social. We've gotten into some grim territory just in the last few minutes, and so the humor is. I basically think that Freud on jokes is just unparalleled. There really isn't anybody, I don't think, who talks about it better. And so the carpe diem aspect of it, the kind of acknowledgement of authority, but the hatred of authority part of it. I mean, most of those sort of antisocial, but also acknowledgement of the social impulses get sort of combined together in some economical form. And it doesn't mean that they, the jokes have to be misogynist. They don't have to be mother-in-law jokes. But the joke and being able to communicate one's own situation to other people, and then for people to recognize that and to kind of laugh at it, is hugely important, because that's a way that we escape despair. Because I think we know that we're not alone in that, and everything around us is conspiring to make us feel alone. So the humor is very, very important as a way to share some of that sense of dissonance that I was talking about earlier. And so it's important that those feelings, those reactions, those responses, that situation get acknowledged. And so this may be, again, this is the indirection, the only way that those deflections can get sort of identified.
Right.
How's that?
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. It was not that unfunny. It was funny enough.